We have a problem, Batman. Gotham needs you again.
Peter Parker operates under the delusion that responsibility equals heroism. But responsibility without wisdom is just elaborate self-destruction. His spider sense creates a false sense of invulnerability that masks genuine tactical blindness. He relies on superhuman reflexes instead of developing strategic thinking. The contingency protocol must account for someone whose greatest strength is also his primary weakness: the compulsive need to save everyone. He will always choose the innocent over himself, always pick the harder path if it means less collateral damage, always sacrifice tactical advantage for moral superiority. This predictability makes him controllable. Present him with enough simultaneous crises and his spider sense becomes useless. It can warn him of danger, but it can't help him prioritize when everything is dangerous. The psychological profile reveals someone carrying guilt like armor, using heroism as penance for failures, real and imagined. His uncle's death taught him that inaction has consequences, but it also programmed him to believe that any tragedy he doesn't prevent is his personal failure. Physical neutralization requires exploiting the gap between his superhuman abilities and very human limitations. Spider-Man's strength and agility are formidable, but they're powered by enhanced metabolism that creates specific vulnerabilities. Extended combat drains his energy reserves rapidly, particularly when he's using web slinging for transportation and restraint simultaneously. His web shooters represent both weapon and weakness, mechanical devices that can malfunction, run out of fluid, or be sabotaged remotely. The adhesive formula is susceptible to specific solvents and extreme temperatures. More critically, his enhanced reflexes depend on the spider sense, which can be overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous threats or interfered with through certain sonic frequencies. The strategy involves forcing sustained combat in enclosed spaces where his mobility advantage is neutralized, using multiple attackers to create sensory overload, and targeting his web shooters early to remove his primary tool for both offense and escape. His healing factor is accelerated but not instantaneous. Accumulated damage will eventually overwhelm his recovery rate. The guilt complex drives every decision Parker makes, transforming heroism into compulsion and responsibility. Into self-punishment, his entire identity revolves around preventing the kind of tragedy that created Spider-Man in the first place. This creates exploitable psychological pressure points, threaten innocent lives, particularly those connected to him personally, and his decision-making becomes completely predictable. He will always choose to save the hostage over capturing the criminal, always pick the civilian over the hero, always sacrifice himself rather than let others pay for his mistakes. The manipulation strategy involves creating scenarios where any action he takes results in someone getting hurt, where saving one person requires abandoning another, where his intervention makes situations worse rather than better. The goal isn't to break his spirit, it's to demonstrate that his approach to heroism creates more problems than it solves, that his guilt-driven compulsions put everyone around him in greater danger. When Parker realizes his presence makes people less safe rather than more protected, his effectiveness as Spider-Man crumbles. Secret identity vulnerability represents his greatest weakness and most dangerous liability. Peter Parker's dual life requires constant deception, compartmentalization, and emotional isolation that creates stress fractures in his psychological foundation. His attachment to maintaining normalcy makes him predictable. He will always return to school, work, or family obligations, creating patterns that can be tracked and exploited. More importantly, his loved ones become weapons that can be used against him without them even knowing it. The strategy involves identifying everyone in his civilian identity's orbit, mapping their relationships and dependencies, then creating situations where Spider-Man's actions put Peter Parker's people at risk. This doesn't require direct threats, simply creating circumstances where Spider-Man's heroics affect Peter's job, education, or relationships forces him to choose between effectiveness as a hero and maintaining his civilian identity. The psychological pressure of living two lives eventually creates cracks that can be exploited, moments where he chooses one identity over the other and reveals which persona he values more. Web-slinging dependency has transformed from ability into addiction. Parker relies so heavily on his webs for mobility that he's lost basic tactical flexibility. Remove his ability to web swing, and he becomes a different fighter entirely, one who hasn't properly trained for ground-based combat. Scenarios. His aerial maneuvers are spectacular but predictable, following physics-based trajectories that can be calculated and intercepted. The webbing itself, while strong, has specific breaking points and can be severed by materials designed for that purpose. More strategically, his web slinging requires anchor points, buildings, structures, objects with sufficient mass to support his momentum. Combat in open areas or environments without suitable anchor points removes his primary tactical advantage. The neutralization strategy involves forcing confrontations in areas specifically designed to counter web slinging: underground tunnels, open fields, spaces with ceilings too low for effective swinging, or environments where the anchor points have been weakened or sabotaged. Without his webs, Spider-Man becomes significantly less mobile and considerably more vulnerable to direct assault. The joke-telling compulsion serves as both psychological defense mechanism and tactical weakness that reveals his emotional state and strategic mindset. Parker uses humor to deflect serious situations, maintain distance from trauma, and cope with the weight of constant life-or-death decisions. But his quips follow predictable patterns based on his stress level, confidence, and emotional stability. High-stress situations produce more frequent jokes with darker undertones, while overwhelming scenarios cause his humor to become forced and desperate. This verbal pattern recognition allows for psychological profiling in real time. His jokes telegraph his mental state, reveal when he's out of his depth, and indicate when he's most vulnerable to manipulation. The tactical application involves monitoring his speech patterns during confrontations to identify optimal timing for escalation or de-escalation. When his jokes stop being clever and start being defensive, when his quips become repetitive or nonsensical, when his humor turns genuinely cruel, these are indicators that his psychological defenses are failing and more aggressive strategies can be employed effectively. What do you think, Alfred?
Master Bruce, you're analyzing Spider-Man as if he were a potential enemy, but Peter Parker represents something you've always struggled to understand. Someone who chose heroism not from trauma or guilt, but from genuine love of humanity. Yes, his responsibility complex could become dangerous if corrupted, but it stems from the same moral foundation that drives your own mission. Your contingency planning assumes he'll become a threat that needs neutralizing. But perhaps the real question is whether you're prepared to help him if he ever loses his way. Spider-Man's greatest weakness isn't his predictability or his guilt, it's his isolation. He carries his burdens alone because he believes protecting his secret identity means protecting those he loves. Sometimes the most strategic intervention isn't a battle plan, but offering the one thing he's never had, a mentor who understands the weight of responsibility and can help him carry it more wisely.
Observation forces recalibration of the entire protocol framework. Parker's isolation isn't just a tactical vulnerability, it's a strategic liability that affects his decision-making and emotional stability. The most effective long-term approach isn't preparing to neutralize him, but ensuring he has proper support systems before his responsibilities overwhelm his judgment. This requires identifying potential mentors within the superhero community who can guide his development, creating communication channels that allow for consultation during critical decisions, and establishing protocols for intervention when his guilt complex begins driving him toward self-destructive choices. The contingency becomes less about combat strategies and more about psychological support networks, less about exploiting weaknesses, and more about strengthening his foundation before cracks become fractures. The goal shifts from preparing to fight Spider-Man to preparing to save Peter Parker from the very qualities that make him heroic. This approach acknowledges that his greatest threat potential comes not from corruption, but from good intentions carried to destructive extremes. Technology countermeasures must account for Parker's scientific genius and improvisational capabilities that allow him to adapt rapidly to new threats and environments. His web shooters are constantly evolving, incorporating new formulas and delivery methods based on recent encounters and identified needs. He routinely develops specialized equipment for specific threats, demonstrating both creativity and technical competence that rivals established inventors and engineers. The counter strategy requires staying ahead of his innovations, predicting likely technological developments based on recent confrontations, and preparing responses to equipment that doesn't yet exist but probably will. This includes monitoring his academic and professional activities for research that might translate into superhero applications, tracking his resource acquisition patterns to identify when he's developing new capabilities, and maintaining technological superiority through superior research and development resources. The approach acknowledges that Parker will always be adapting, always improving, always learning from previous encounters, which means any contingency plan must be dynamic rather than static, evolving as quickly as his own capabilities advance.